Oh, thank you so much for joining today's session on key considerations for county and district-owned hospitals. This session, the last of our institute presentations today, will cover how to overcome troubled board and county district dynamics, key hurdles and constraints of county district ownership regarding pursuing preferred strategic options, strategies for addressing unique aspects of county and district ownership, and county or district complications for partnering. And with that, I will hand it over to Jeff Sommer and Trent Cranky.
Thank you very much, JD. Glad that you all are joining us for this session. I just need to there we go. We now have our slides up. And Trent and I will be pleased to take you through some of the considerations that county and district-owned hospitals face and should consider as they think about partnering. One of the things I would note is we've got a set of key takeaways here that Trent and I will walk through. Trent, did you want to start us off?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. So county and hospital districts operate under a different set of legal and political issues than a private system. And so we hope to provide you with practical lessons and suggested next steps based on real transactions that both Jeff and I have been involved with during our careers. There's no question that public hospitals face a unique set of challenges, and most public hospital failures are not caused by bad intent, but by preventable governance and process breakdowns. In addition, for many aspects of a transaction, compliance with applicable rules and regulations that apply to these county-owned hospitals or hospital districts, such as transparency, it's not optional. Right? And so the strategy must be designed from the very beginning to accomplish and comply with the legal framework.
That's really a helpful construct. And what I would say is we often see county and district hospitals coming with some level of disagreement or strife or dysfunction between the hospital board and the county or district board. And it's really important for those issues to be addressed and for there to be some sort of collaborative or at least constructive path forward for those boards to take. The communication and that level of trust is so important. And what we often find is creating a venue for members or representatives of those respective boards, the hospital board and the county or district board, to meet together to work through those issues and evaluate information is really a good starting point. Really, I guess the word I would use, invaluable, and something that, frankly, if it's not addressed, will become a continuing source of aggravation and distraction for the organization going forward. I guess the last thing I would say is here we are. Moving ahead, there's a brief bio and contact information. So if you have questions you want to direct to Trent, you've got his email and direct dial there. Same for me. And there's a little bit of background on both firms. If you're not familiar with Stroudwater or Reed Clayman, the law firm, there's some information there for you as well. So our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the strategic context, and then we're going to really ground you in why county and district hospitals are different and what can and should be done about those differences and key takeaways. And then we should have some time at the end for some discussion. Want to just briefly orient you. Some of you who have been in the other sessions will have seen these slides before. What I would just want to emphasize in this is that somewhere between 80 and 90% of rural hospitals fit in the middle three categories. It's a relative rarity for folks to be in that far right category. That's a locally governed, thriving, adequately resourced, high-performing local health system. Oftentimes, the performance isn't at that level. It's somewhere in the middle, what we call strategic drift or purgatory. That is, the organization does not really have a long-term sustainable path or level of performance currently, And it's really in a question of whether it can improve its performance and position in the market, or is it going to worsen over time? And so it really becomes kind of a tipping point, if you will. And then you can see bracketing that center category are really two different outcomes as it relates to partnering. One is a good partnership with a good partner that adds value and specifically addresses some of the needs and constraints of an organization. So if they need access to capital, that's part of the partnership. We've seen partnerships where either the partner or the structure doesn't align that way. And frankly, the majority of partnerships we've seen are in some way sub-optimizing rural affiliates. Might not mean they're a bad partnership, but it does mean they're missing opportunities to create additional value. But we do see some partnerships to the left of the middle there that are, in some respects, maybe predatory, or they're missing so much value, they're actually destroying value at the rural affiliate. And ironically, undermining system performance over time. We've talked about that in different sessions today as well. The worst outcome being closure, and certainly want to avoid that if we can. Closure is all too real a reality, and you can see the concentration on states in the far right there: Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Alabama being the top 5 states for closures over the last 15 years. And you can see the geographic dispersal in the map. And then there's also a time lapse, if you will, by year. And you can see a real spike in 2023 and 2024 with closures there being the highest in that time period. Now, those include conversions to rural emergency hospitals, which are not closures in the truest sense of the word, but might reflect a significant downgrade in service and accessibility for a community or county if that were to occur. So something to be really keeping our eyes on as we think about risks. The outlook by the rating agencies suggests a complicated trajectory. I find, first of all, these are geared towards investment grade or rated credits, which tend to skew larger than many of our rural clients. Most of our rural clients are not rated. They are using other sources of capital. And so these do skew larger, but it suggests that the outlook is uncertain. And especially as you get into smaller organizations, some of the things they talk about here, robust balance sheets, being a resource and a mitigating factor, is relatively infrequent in rural. We just don't see that many organizations that have really robust balance sheets. I think the best comment is the last one on this page. Elevated macroeconomic pressure could revert the sector outlook to deteriorating, especially if there's a decline in profitability and payer mix erosion. Well, I think with the changes to Medicaid and the changes to the healthcare exchanges, I think it's hard to see a scenario where payer mix doesn't trend negatively over the next few years once those changes take effect with more uninsured folks. This slide, we really wanted to talk about some of the factors that are really driving industry performance and, frankly, the pressure to consolidate. And what I would say is continued margin pressure and payer mix deterioration, the switch to high deductible health plans, even somebody now who has insurance through their employer, what used to be the gold standard, commercial insurance. Now you're seeing, hey, there's more exposure to bad debt because of those high deductibles. You see economies of scale, workforce shortages compounded by public sector constraints being an issue, and increased competition also being a key driver of performance and, in some respects, the need to partner. I would also then say that for the county and district owned, scrutiny from regulators and media in particular media, if these disputes between county-owned and district-owned hospitals and the boards is public, then it is problematic, and that scrutiny can be really chilling in terms of recruiting needed professionals to the organization. Economies of scale, I think we're all familiar with, but economies of skill are really about the fact that this is a knowledge business and it's an incredibly complex business. And so the specific specialized expertise you need to operate a hospital successfully in a very complex regulatory and business environment and clinical environment requires access to those specialized personnel and areas of expertise. I think for county and district-owned hospitals, growing reliance on supplemental payments and intergovernmental transfers and tax revenue and public-private partnerships are all key trends, but also in some respects might mask some of the underlying operational challenges. And I do think, and Trent, you may want to comment on this, the dynamic between consolidation pressure and political resistance to affiliation, but also I would say even beyond the political, it's a kind of community or community representative resistance to affiliation. Those things are that balance and that tension is something that a lot of organizations are really grappling with today. I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add to that, Trent.
Yeah, I'd say on the first box there on margin compression and payer mix deterioration, another thing we're seeing a lot in Texas is the increase of Medicare Advantage plans, which also is really hurting many of the rural hospitals, rural public hospitals especially. And yeah, here in Texas, people like their independence. They like to make their own decisions, generally speaking. And so when you're having these negotiations with consolidation versus remaining independent, you may have to give up some of that decision-making authority. And so that's always a delicate subject for boards to consider when going through this strategy process.
It's great.
So Jeff set the stage about the legal or the landscape across all hospitals, but now we're going to add another layer of issues that county and hospital district owned hospitals have to deal with. And I'll start with the obvious, and that's a core distinction between public hospitals and private hospitals is that public hospitals are operated under statutes. And so unlike a private or nonprofit hospital, public hospital has no inherent powers. Every action or anything that hospital can accomplish really must be traced back to statutory authority. And so some examples may include the structure of the board and the board powers, taxing authority, ability to take on debt, whether the hospital or the board can purchase or acquire assets and where that real estate may or may not be located, the ability to contract with third parties, and also dissolution and bankruptcy options. So a whole set of legal issues to consider beyond the healthcare landscape. And so these limitations, authority, perhaps even tools available to a public hospital that are dictated by state law means that these decisions are not solely the result of business judgment alone. In contrast, private systems can really move quickly and focus on the bottom line when they have to, whereas public boards don't have that freedom all the times. And so sometimes there can be this tension between the mission of the public board and the financial reality. A board or a hospital may be tasked with mandating access to care, providing care for the community. Indigent care may be a requirement for the board, but if you don't have the funds or revenue to achieve those goals, that's a problem. And so the financial reality can be, going back to that previous slide, that the payer mix is 70, 80% Medicaid, and that's a challenge. And there's very little, that's not necessarily a temporary issue. That doesn't usually change over time. And so public accountability really changes the risk calculus when you're going through these discussions considering partnerships. I will say that in a public hospital, in my opinion, how you decide, how you make these decisions can be just as important as what you decide, or even more important. And what I mean by that is this statutory framework, these issues that you have to comply with, they can be just as important, governance, transactions, strategy, etc., as what the end result may be. Stop there. I think we have our first polling question. So we'd love for you to read the question and answer it if you have time. The question is, how aligned are the district county board and the hospital board in your communities? Okay. Get your answers in. Okay, and the results are in. It looks like a pretty even split. We have 25% that are very aligned, which is terrific, 25% somewhat aligned, 17% not very aligned, 8% totally unaligned, and 25% NA. In my experience, usually when they're calling the lawyer, it's because the relationship is either not very aligned or totally unaligned, unfortunately. Moving on to the next slide. This is governance and decision-making structure. So, as you all know, public hospital boards are often appointed, elected. Those jobs are often unpaid, and board members are frequently balancing those volunteer duties on the public board with other civic, professional, political roles, and of course their life at home. And so that can be a challenge because people are distracted and they're pulled a bunch of different ways. In addition, fiduciary duties to the organization also exist. As such, the appearance and process matter just as much as the substance of those decisions. The board has a duty to follow those rules and regulations to really work on behalf of the public that they're representing. And so they can't be purely outcome focused. There has to be a process that they comply with. Jeff, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I would comment. In the last slide, you made the comment. I think it was really telling. By the time they're calling the attorneys, it really does indicate some significant misalignment. To some degree, it's the same thing when they start calling a consultant as well. Maybe not to the same degree of misalignment, but that's very true. What I would say is that that question of the hospital board versus, say, the county commission or a district board, the ability of the county commission or the district board to appoint hospital board members, can be very helpful, but it can also lead to, I think, the blurred lines of accountability, where we've seen in our experience the county commission essentially force the removal of a board chair or even dissolve the hospital board that they've appointed. They had the authority to do that. That can be necessary in certain instances, but as you alluded to, I think when you get to the point where you're dissolving a hospital board because you have the authority to do so, things have really reached a point where something needs to be done around that blurred lines of accountability. And I think it just can create so many issues. I often hear it described as in an ideal way, it's a tenant and a landlord, where the hospital board is operating the county or district-owned asset. They're the tenant. But on the other hand, the county or district board as the landlord is really uncomfortable because they're also responsible to the community, and they want to make sure that that asset is being operated and managed effectively. And that then creates a huge political push to be more involved in the operations of the tenant or the hospital board. And I think that tension is something that we see really aggravating some of these dynamics.
Yeah, I think when that decision-making authority is a bit unclear, who reports to who and who is ultimately responsible, it does create some exposure for all of everyone involved and the potential for conflict. Another common kind of failure I see is the informal, and it's related, is the informal delegation and side conversations that can take place outside of the board meetings. You have a board, and a couple of those board members, maybe they're meeting with the commissioner's court or the city, or they're meeting, with the CEO, and they're in the loop as to what's going on, but the rest of the board may not be as informed. Not only can that obviously violate Open Meetings Act laws and create other issues, but it just doesn't take into account, obviously, the voice of the entire board, and can really fracture a board when they're going through this decision-making process.
Gotcha.
So obviously, each state has its own unique open meetings laws, public records laws. But one thing that's true is that when these laws are generally unforgiving when it comes to violating them and the intent of the board. It doesn't matter if the board intended to violate the law or not. Generally, they're pretty black and white. And the reason that's important is when it comes to public scrutiny, the public or maybe scrutiny by the media, they don't necessarily care if the board intended to comply with these laws or not. They're going to be quick to point out that the board did not violate or did violate these open meetings laws. And so some common examples that may arise in a potential transaction would be inadequate agenda descriptions, serial emails or texts creating a quorum outside of a meeting, such as with the county commissioner's court or just other board members, or misuse of executive session during meetings. At least in Texas, there are very limited exceptions under the Open Meetings Act as to when you can go into closed session. And it's not unheard of for a client to really want to push the limits of those laws and conduct as much of the discussions and planning sessions in closed session as possible. And you have to be really careful with that. And so although it may be important to use the executive session when it's available, broad policy deliberations and consensus building should really occur in public. And many of these failed transactions or affiliations unravel due to the inability of these boards to follow the process. It's not necessarily always economics. It can be a lack of transparency, which creates mistrust to the public, to the media, and whether this is a great deal for the community or a poor deal may not be that important to the public. They're going to have a distrust on whatever decision the board may be trying to make. And so when board members are going through this process, a question they should ask themselves is, can we explain this deal to the public? And if they can't, or they're not ready to do that, then there could be an issue. Maybe not, but there could be. Jeff, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Trent. One of the things I did a little bit of a Google search on this to look at, hospital controversies, and it didn't take long to find some headlines, and you can just see how these play out in a community. The second bullet there, taxpayers will pay for hospital boards' mistakes. That's something that nobody wants to see, whether you're a board member or frankly, a community member. That's just a terrible headline. And, once a set of disagreements become public like this, it really does kind of take on a life of its own. And it's hard to kind of de-escalate and get, you know, folks thinking constructively. And so, to Trent's point, one of the points I think is important to emphasize is, the appropriate level of transparency and doing so in a timely way. I think nothing aggravates folks in a community if they feel like they're being hoodwinked. On the other time, there may be times where there's certain information that can't be shared at that moment in time because you're in the middle of a confidential negotiation. And so understanding where the limits are, as Trent alluded to, is incredibly important in both maintaining a process that protects the organization and the community, but by the same token, not running afoul of state law and not riling up the community. But in any instance where you have a county or district board and a hospital board, and headlines like this are part of the process, obviously something's broken. And it really speaks to, it might be decades of dysfunction and distrust that exist sometimes between those bodies. Sometimes it's more recent and it's a specific event. It can be the hospital board's decision to let go a beloved provider in the community, and that stirs people up. But it can be also, perhaps more significant than that. So headlines like this do have dire consequences for local hospitals. And that, again, as I alluded to before, if there's a story and the hospital is the center of controversy and a really significant dispute in the local community, it becomes hard to recruit management. It becomes hard to recruit people to work in that environment, recruit physicians, providers of any type. They want to be thoughtful about where they go, and nobody wants to enter into a situation that's highly adversarial, highly dysfunctional. And so, really figuring out the ways to avoid that scenario is important. So, polling
Yeah.
question number 2. Yes,
I
Troy.
will add, as an aside, about 10 to 12 years ago, I attended a county commissioners meeting and spoke on behalf of the hospital authority there. And it was a contentious meeting. And of course, the newspaper wrote an article, published it online. And for years and years and years, if you Googled my name, the first thing that popped up was this small community hospital article on Google. And so I think finally it worked its way down the search results. But I mean, it followed my name, and I had a very small part in the discussion for years. And so these headlines, they don't go away easily once they're posted.
Right, right. That kind of scares me. I'm gonna have to be careful in my travels. So the question is, have disagreements between the district and county board and the hospital board had a negative impact on the hospital? And then selecting whether it's definitely a negative impact, somewhat a negative impact, limited, or not at all, or NA. Again, have disagreements between the district and county board and the hospital board had a negative impact on the hospital. Okay. Going to end the poll there. And it looks like about a little north of 20% have said definitely, about another 10% said somewhat, 20% said limited. So all in all, 50% are saying it's had either limited, somewhat, or definitely a negative impact. 10% said not at all, and about a third said NA. So, we see this play out, and it's, usually the end result of at least years, but in some instances decades of disputes. And in some instances we've seen, picking up on Trent's anecdote, we had an instance where I think there was a former nurse manager who was let go by the hospital. Again, I don't know the circumstances. Might have been unjustly, might have been justly, but that nurse manager then assumed a role a leading role at the hospital district, and really enacted a vendetta against the hospital and hospital management as a result. And it just became very, very public and really larger than any two people as a result. So these things are highly flammable, so to speak. So how do we de-escalate? How do we build trust and break down some of this dysfunction to the degree it exists? What we've seen work, and we'll contrast, a community that took an approach like this versus one that didn't later in the presentation. But the idea of initiating regular communication between at least the leadership of both boards, and potentially creating a venue where key members or some subset of the boards can work together. That then starts breaking down the distrust. I'm no longer going to assume the worst about you because I've met with you and we've discussed these issues, and maybe I don't agree with you at this point. I'm still waiting for the data and the facts and the analysis. I can at least appreciate that you think you're acting in the best judgment. And it starts to lower the temperature in most instances, as that we found. So regular communication and creating a shared vehicle is kind of the starting point. Again, this is going to sound a little self-serving, but it's important to be able to bring context to these discussions that is beyond the local history, but brings in national perspective and perspective from other situations. So having an outside expert facilitator, whether that's legal counsel or whether that's a consultant, but having somebody that can help break down the distrust, and what we would say is the next step, really develop what we call a common fact base. So there's the expression, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And that's really important in these kind of hospital district, county, commissioners to hospital board disputes. Let's make sure we're all using the same information. We're not going to relitigate issues from the past that might be highly loaded, but when we talk about where the hospital is and where it needs to go, let's make sure we have a common understanding. And if there's something that's missed, you fill in that gap. If somebody has questions, you address that gap. Once you've developed a common fact base, it has the ability, frankly, to take a lot of the emotion out of the conversation. Because what you're doing now is you're filling a vacuum with factual information that is accurate and is coming from trusted sources. You're making sure that people are heard during the process in which you're doing that. So if somebody has a particular issue or a particular concern, you're looking to make sure you address that issue, assuming that it's not something completely outlandish. So at the end of this process, you've created, communication, you've created a venue where they can interact and communicate and update each other regularly. You've had some facilitation, and you've developed a common understanding of where the hospital is and where it's going, or where it's been. And then that leads to the next point, which is let's talk about the future rather than relitigating the past, which has no benefit to the organization. Let's talk about what is that common vision that we can develop, that shared vision to the benefit of the community and where we go. And if there is consensus and buy-in to that plan, then regardless of what the direction is, maybe it's we're committed to remaining the best independent county and district-owned hospital in Texas, then that's your plan. But maybe we're going to evaluate, maybe we need a performance improvement plan to really get us to where we need to be. Maybe we need to look at partnering. Whatever that outcome is, there's hopefully consensus around that. And it really becomes important to have a communication plan, because the community is seeing all this negativity, all the stories, and what you're trying to do is change the narrative. And so it's important that certainly leaders from both boards be bought into this, and that the messaging around what is now known and understood and what the future vision is communicated to the community and stakeholders at large. And lastly, critical to stay focused on fundamentals. And what do we mean by that? Making sure that the things that drive hospital performance aren't ignored, that those are on sound footing, and if necessary, there's a performance improvement plan that is going to, set the hospital on a course for success. Again, whatever the strategic option is selected. This sounds basic, and it might even sound obvious to all of you, but it's striking how often either key steps are missed, or frankly, an approach like this is disregarded, and the results are suboptimal. And we'll share a case study that speaks to this. So we're now polling question number 3. Whoops, sorry. Polling question number 3. I don't know if there we go. What approach is best suited for your community? Again, building off some of these steps, assuming you have dysfunction. And I think we had about half of the respondents who said that there was some negative impacts on the hospital. Which of these approaches do you believe would be most beneficial to the local community and the local hospital? Give it a little more time. All right, I'm gonna share results. It's interesting. Folks said developing a common vision and objectives for the future of healthcare delivery. I would agree. I think that is a really critical step, and having consensus around that. The thing I would say is, in most instances, I don't know that you need to do every step. There were 4 steps listed before that, but there is some work that typically is necessary before you can get there. And that is, both boards and the leadership of both boards need to be speaking to each other and need to be willing to work with each other. And that is a prerequisite. And how you get there is less important as long as you get there. But that's interesting. I would agree with you. Without that common vision and a set of objectives for the future, which there's consensus around, it's really hard to move forward and not keep relitigating the past and not be stuck in neutral. And so a couple of folks indicated that or one person said, develop a set of objectives to guide the future and evaluate options, i.e. strategic options, and then somebody was unsure. So interesting feedback there. Thank you for that. So strategic and operating fundamentals. What do we mean when we talk about that? Well, part of that is understanding the strategic and operating risk profile of the organization. We've talked about this in some other settings. What I will say is just one thing. The board should examine at least 5-year or 7-year trends in key financial, operating, market, and value metrics once a year. Not just comparing prior year to this year or this year to budget. It's really hard to detect subtle shifts looking at that basis of comparison. Much more helpful to look at 5-year and 7-year trends, and then you can determine and say, wow, our quality scores have actually gotten better, significantly better over time. Or, geez, there's been a slow and steady decrease in market share over the last 7 years. And that has been correlated to our financial performance. Let's understand why. So long-term trend analysis, quantifying gaps in performance, and importantly, if the organization is stressed or distressed, defining what the cash run rate is. What we mean by cash run rate is, if you have a negative cash flow, how long will it take you at the current negative cash flow performance to exhaust the organization's cash and reserves? And that becomes a key measure of how much, we call it runway. How much maneuvering room do we have before we're effectively, insolvent, we're out of cash, and we can no longer operate the facility? You want to change trajectory well in advance of running out of cash. And that's a great milestone to keep track of and understand how that's shifting with time. Growth opportunities, we talked about performance improvement, and vetting strategic options. Again, all options have risk. And when we say strategic option, we're talking about continued independence, potentially partnering, or on a more extreme level, if it's a severely distressed organization, whether or not bankruptcy or restructuring is the appropriate option. So those are all things on the table, and depending upon circumstance, some or all of them should be part of the analysis. Lastly, don't be paralyzed by uncertainty or risk. All options have inherent risk. It's about matching the option that best addresses the organization's constraints, needs, and objectives. So that's really the what we mean when we talk about fundamentals. I think we've shared this slide before in other sessions. I'm just going to say for the one point I want to make with this is performance improvement is a real and important risk mitigation tool at the available to any hospital and any organization. The critical element needed for performance improvement is one, time. This isn't something that can happen instantaneously. Some things can happen very quickly. Other things may take years before the organization sees the benefit, i.e., recruiting new physicians to town. It can be lead time on recruitment, and then there's lead time during the ramp up, all of which are expenses. And so before the organization can see a benefit, it takes time. But this is a lever available to every organization. Brent.
Wanted to talk about avoiding preventable failures and touch on a few common issues Jeff and I see when public hospitals are in trouble and trying to make decisions on a often too quick of a basis. When a public hospital ends up in litigation or under media scrutiny, public scandal, or maybe even worse, with a closed hospital, the root cause is often not because of fraud or intentional bad actions by the board or even gross negligence. Instead, it's usually related to preventable governance failures that just compounded year after year after year. And so how do you protect the board and the organization and its decision makers from these issues? So three categories we often see get hospitals in trouble are process errors, documentation gaps, and board role confusion. When it comes to process errors, I would encourage early and honest public engagement to, when making a big partnership decision, get input from the public. What's important to them? What services are important to the organization? Make them feel involved to the extent it makes sense and is doable, of course. Not going through the required sequence of events, the appropriate notices, taking appropriate minutes, publicly bidding certain contracts before a handshake deal's been made, that can get a hospital in trouble. Did the board approve the contracts or the steps that the board was supposed to approve, or did management take these things and run with it and not get the required approvals? There can be a lot of different examples of process errors, and it's really going to vary depending on the structure of the board and the type of hospital district or county-owned hospital. But whatever that process is, it's real important to follow it, of course. The next is documentation gaps. What I mean here is really, let's focus on board minutes, for example. I know board minutes can be a pain. Often they're not reviewed closely. They can be rubber stamped. People don't want to propose edits and kind of be a burden to the board secretary. But especially when you're considering a partnership or a large transaction, it's imperative to make sure those board minutes are accurate and reflect the board's decision-making process and discussion. And the reason that's really going to help the board if or when its decisions are ever questioned by the media or the public. The board then can go back and say, no, wait, we did this, this, and this. And it's really there to benefit the board, not to be a burden to the board. And a third example is board role confusion. The number one thing I often see is the board waiting too long, relying on management to kind of dig itself out of this hole and not getting involved sooner. So delays are a huge common issue. The other thing we see is when the board doesn't trust management, sometimes the board gets too involved in operational decisions, which is not always, or very seldom appropriate. And so having the right structure between management and trust in management to handle the operational decisions while still taking those policy and big decisions back to the board is important. Of course, I mentioned management setting policy or taking action without formal board action. And then, of course, we also discussed potential conflict with the county or those that appoint the board. Who's in charge, who should be making these big decisions. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that the board doesn't have to be perfect. That's not the standard. Really, the goal is to make sure the board's properly informed when it's making these decisions and has followed the governance process in an open, lawful method in accordance with the applicable rules to the board. The next slide is some other additional unique risk factors. Of course, we're talking about rural hospitals and qualified board members that are involved in different areas of business. Leadership often has deep business ties with the community, and so even perceived conflicts can undermine public trust and invite scrutiny by the media or the public. And so it's important to have any potential conflicts disclosed early, have that board member recuse himself or herself if necessary, and then documenting this process in the minutes. Political turnover can also be problematic. Of course, I always encourage my clients to go out and find and encourage reputable, diverse, qualified board members to run for election or appointment on these boards. That's important. But regardless, terms are limited, and there is going to be some turnover eventually. And so, again, it just highlights the importance to make sure that these decisions were finalized legally. They're well documented in case they are revisited, delayed, or questioned down the road once there's been some turnover. And kind of on a similar note, long-term commitments must also survive these short-term cycles. And so any change to hospital operations, bringing in new services, taking out debt, establishing a new service line, those are inherently long-term commitments. And so when you have elected officials operating on a 2, 3, 4-year term, that can create some tension between governance and continuity, especially if those board members are not going to hold over for an additional term. And so these agreements and this process must be structured to withstand leadership changes because those will happen. Jeff, anything to add to those slides?
I think those are well stated.
Great. Well, we have another polling question. I think this is our last polling question.
Yes, sir. Does our technical team have the polling question? If not, we'll continue.
Okay.
I guess we'll continue. So, concluding thoughts and key takeaways. I love this quote. It gets back to something we said earlier. There is no risk-free strategic option. I think Peter Drucker said it much better. But 2 examples of 2 communities facing significant hospital board to county or district board strife. And for those of you familiar with the movie It's a Wonderful Life with James Stewart, classic Christmas movie. Pottersville was the outcome, the bad outcome if the lead character had not ever lived, and it kind of had a local tyrant in it. In this case, Potterville Each board had their own advisor. They never had a shared process or any kind of a working group. Distrust and conflict characterized the entire process. Ultimately, the district wins. It took over the hospital and forced a bankruptcy, continued controversy, and in the end, a new partner was brought in at fire sale terms. So they never got beyond the distrust and the dysfunction. Contrast Bedford Falls, which had had more than a decade of dysfunction and open dispute between the hospital district and the board. They had the good fortune of having two new leaders take over both of those boards and said, enough of this. We're going to work together. So they hired an advisor for both boards, formed a joint committee, focused on consensus in terms of conflict, got buy-in. They arrived at a shared vision for the future and attracted an internationally renowned partner with a $250 million investment in the community. Now, these communities were in different places, but essentially they started with the same level of dysfunction and ended up in very, very different places. And so you can see these are quotes from both board chairs in Bedford Falls, and this reflects how good it felt and how effective and successful they were at putting the community first ahead of the agendas that had kind of tarnished the reputation of the hospital going back decades. So really a stark contrast there between a good process and a bad process. With that, I want to just see if there's any questions in the few minutes we have available to us.
Hey, Jeff. Yes, a couple have come in. First of all, fantastic presentation. It was really great to hear the balance of kind of strategic and legal perspectives as they related to the county or district facilities. One of the questions you indicated, bad process is what is more likely to get boards in trouble. Are there a couple of examples where you see boards most commonly making missteps in their process?
Yes, a couple of real world examples we've seen. For example, certain hospital districts in Texas have public bidding requirements. They can't sell real estate without publishing a notice and receiving bids from the property. Well, there's situations where a hospital may have a great piece of property, worked out a handshake deal with the local hospital system to come in, maybe build a hospital on that land. But maybe they're not offering the best price, or maybe that's not the best use for that property. And regardless of whether or not the deal can go through, it can be too late sometimes if you don't follow the process. And it's not just selling real estate. It can be, entering into a long-term lease or financing. I've seen hospitals think they can go out and public hospitals go out and borrow money, not realizing, no, they're a governmental entity. It's much more complicated than that. And so the question boards need to think about is, what does their enabling legislation require?
Awesome. Jeff, anything to add to that?
I would say on the non-legal side, some of the stuff we already touched on, which is, not creating a venue, a place where the board leadership from both boards can meet and start to build that trust, getting over that distrust. And that common fact base is one of those things that we've just seen it completely transform the discussion from one that's emotion-based and completely focused on the past to one that is fact-based and is starting to think about the future. Those are the two things that I would suggest.
Yeah, that's great. And again, any questions that do come in, we will respond to. Those will be in the final paperwork that gets sent over. I'd ask everyone now, thank you for attending this one. Go back to the main lobby and go into the final presentation. Those that remain will be champions. Go into the final presentation, and Jeff and Claire will share their thoughts on key takeaways from the day in today's Partnership Institute. So thanks very much, Trent, and thanks very much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you, JD. Thank you so much, Trent. Really appreciate your insights today.
Great conference. Thanks.
Thank you.